First tonight, President Trump has described his meeting with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping as amazing, saying they made a lot of outstanding decisions. The talks in South Korea began with a handshake and lasted for an hour and 40 minutes. Speaking to reporters on his flight home, Mr. Trump said Mr. Xi had agreed to lift restrictions on rare earth mineral exports for a year and to do more to curb production of the drug fentanyl. In return, Mr. Trump said he'd agreed to reduce some tariffs.
I've agreed, as you know, I put a 20% tariff on China because of the fentanyl coming in, which is it's a big tariff. And based on his statements today, I reduced it by 10%, so it's 10% instead of 20%, effective immediately. But all of the rare earth has been settled, and that's for the world. I mean, you know, worldwide. This, I guess you could really say this was a worldwide situation, not just a U.S. situation. So we continue to produce the rare earths and buy the rare earths and everything else, you know, when you see from other countries. But China is that whole situation, that roadblock is gone now. There's no roadblock at all on rare earth. That will hopefully disappear from our vocabulary for a little while.
President Trump. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from Washington, D.C. by Phelim Kine, China correspondent for the digital news outlet Politico. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. What do we know about what happened in the talks beyond the fanfare?
I think that what we're getting in terms of readouts from both sides suggests that President Trump's hyperbole really isn't matched in terms of deliverables. I think if you take a look at the key components of what both leaders, China's Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump, have walked out with, essentially a reset back to where the two sides were back in May. Essentially, the two sides have agreed that they're going to stop punching each other in the face trade-wise and try to continue to negotiate a longer-term, more substantive trade agreement. But the key challenges, the key fissures, the key contradictions continue and were not addressed in this meeting.
Well, it did come across that way, didn't it? Of course, the two countries, as you mentioned, have been locked in trade deadlocks over a number of issues. So this meeting was quite significant in that sense. But even then, I mean, you know these things better than we do. When it comes to trade deals, the important things are usually in the detail, aren't they?
Absolutely. And look, let's give credit where credit's due. So we do know that the two sides walked out of that agreement with three major clawbacks in terms of hostility. And the first one is that the U.S. has agreed to essentially put on hold or suspend a sanctions regime on Chinese companies in exchange for Beijing allowing the free or uninterrupted trade of rare earths, critical minerals, which are essential for U.S. civilian and defense manufacturing. Both sides agreed to suspend for a year really onerous punitive port fees on each other's cargo vessels. And so, these things are not to be underestimated. And President Trump apparently also walked out with an agreement that China will renew its needed and massive purchases of U.S. soybeans, which China has essentially boycotted throughout the current U.S. soybean harvest season, which has been a major political liability for President Trump in crucial farming states.
Well, I mean, just listening to you and that list of things that China has apparently agreed to do for a reduction in tariffs. I mean, those tariffs still seem pretty prohibitive. I mean, on the face of it, it doesn't sound as if China's got a particularly good deal, does it? I mean, is the Chinese version of events echoing what the Americans are saying?
So the Chinese readout is extremely detail free to a large extent. It essentially aligned with what I just outlined. I think there are two things are really. I think that my view is essentially that China has walked out of this with more gains than the U.S. because the U.S. has agreed to reduce one of the tariffs, one of the quote unquote fentanyl tariffs, by 10%. So they get a 10% reduction in their current tariffs. They're still high. They're still around an average of 45% for Chinese imports, but every little bit helps. And keep in mind that reduction is for Chinese cooperation on reducing the flow of chemicals that China ships to Mexico that cartels process into fentanyl and synthetic opioids, which ends up killing thousands of Americans every year. But there is no details from Beijing in terms of what they're going to do. They haven't committed to anything besides saying that we will cooperate. So it's very ambiguous, very fungible. And I would say that the most important thing is that Beijing has a global chokehold on the supply of rare earths, both in terms of sources and in terms of processing. And that will continue for years. So President Trump may have bought a 1 year reprieve on the restrictions that Beijing can easily apply or reapply. But that is something that will always be, or for the foreseeable future, will be in Beijing's pocket in terms of trade leverage against the US. And President Trump of the United States can't do anything about that for a matter of years. That's important.
Absolutely. And in that regard, would it be fair to say that there's a lot of expectation from not just China, but the US as well? I mean, they're the two biggest economies in the world, and their supply chains are very integrated with virtually every region of the world. And there are many businesses who've been living in very uncertain times and who've not been able to plan their exports to these two very large markets. So they're looking for some certainty from these two countries, aren't they?
Exactly. They're looking for certainty, and what they've got is they have essentially a fragile truce. And I'd add they have another fragile truce. Keep in mind that there have been 5 meetings between senior U.S. and Chinese trade negotiators since April, and each one ends with rhetoric about how we're making progress and things are great, but these problems keep emerging, these eruptions, whether it's China tapping the brakes on rare earth exports, whether it's the US introducing these port fees on Chinese vessels, which Beijing rolls out a tit for tat response to. So we have today a fragile truce that really could be disrupted and probably will be disrupted by something, given the nature of the relationship within the coming weeks or months. I'd like to think that we do have a longer term move toward more predictable trade ties, but judging by past behavior, I think that might be over optimistic.
Well, I was rather going to ask you what you thought about what's really been fundamentally achieved in this first face-to-face meeting in 6 years. You've kind of answered it. I was going to ask you whether it's the trade war is now over, whether this is a truce or just a de-escalation, but your obvious conclusion is that it is a truce. That there is now talk of President Trump going to China and even of a return visit. I mean, does that bode well for ironing out more details and really hammering out a sort of concrete and final trade deal?
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a really good point. I think that the fact that President Trump has announced that he will go to Beijing for, I assume, a summit in April, that buys time for both sides to put meat on the bones of a really substantive trade deal, not these kind of short-term time buying stopgap measures that we have right now. And so that's something to hope for. But in terms of that meeting, I think one of the most important things about that meeting was a significant omission. For weeks now, U.S. negotiators, specifically Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, has been saying a TikTok deal is in the bag. It's finalized. We just got to do this. We just got to get it through the Chinese bureaucracy. And he was saying just a few days ago that for sure the TikTok deal would be, the word was, would be consummated by President Trump and Xi Jinping in South Korea. Well, guess what? It didn't happen. Trump didn't even mention TikTok. This is something he wants badly. And in the Chinese readout, they said that talks will continue about TikTok. So again, very nebulous, very ambiguous. And the gap between rhetoric and reality remains very large.
Well, we're all the wiser for speaking with you. Thank you very much indeed. Phelim Kine is the China correspondent for the digital news outlet Politico. He was talking to me on the line there from Washington, D.C.